Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. Before we jump in, I have just a few housekeeping notes and community guidelines to mention. If you have any sound or technical issues today, please let me know in the chat box with a direct message. I'll do my best to help you out. This webinar is being recorded, and the recording, as well as a PDF of the presentation, will be sent out to all registrants within the next week or so. We will be doing a brief Q&A at the end of the presentation, but please feel free to send your questions into the chat box at any time, and then we're just going to get through all of them at the end. And finally, for our community guidelines, we ask that you hold each other with mutual respect, come to the space teachable, and stay engaged with our presenters throughout the program. So now I'm just going to share a little bit about the Documentary Heritage Preservation Services for New York program in case any of you are unfamiliar with us. DIPSNY, as we like to call ourselves, is a program of the New York State Archives and the New York State Library that provides free planning and education services to support the vast network of collecting institutions such as archives, libraries, historical societies, museums, and other organizations that safeguard and ensure access to New York's historical records and library research materials. DIPSNY services are provided by the Conservation Center for Art and Historic Artifacts and include archival needs assessments, preservation and condition surveys, strategic planning assistance, and access to a variety of educational programs, such as today's webinar. So to learn more about any of our services, please visit us at dhpsny.org. And with that, I'm going to pass things over to our presenters for today, Hope and Saguna, to get us started. Thanks all.
All right, and thank you for that welcome. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I had a chance to quickly look through the participants that are joining us today, and I was happy to see a lot of familiar faces. I won't call out individuals, but I'm happy everyone could join us. And I did see a couple names on there from Niagara Falls, so a special appreciation for that. My name is Hope Dunbar. I'm the University Archivist here at the University of Buffalo, where I oversee the stewardship of our archival collections and lead initiatives that enhance access and discovery. I'll be talking us through the first half of our presentation on the development of our project, the overview of the collection history, and specific considerations that went into our work.
Hi, everyone. My name is Saguna Shankar. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Information Science here at the University at Buffalo. And I will be bringing my perspective as a researcher, as well as a member of the team, the redaction team. In my research, I study care for community data. And with this hat on, I've been examining different stakeholders' use of data and information during the Love Canal environmental crisis, which we'll be talking more about today. So I first learned about this crisis from Hope through an event that she organized several years ago. And I have long appreciated her commitment to connecting community and university folks to these archival collections to advance learning about this significant environmental justice issue. So I will be continuing on with our presentation from the second half, discussing our process, our specific examples of what redaction looks like, our access model, and our reflections for archival practice. We will have a Q&A session that will be hosted at the end of the presentation, so we welcome you to please hold on to your questions until that point. So back to you for now, Hope.
All right, thank you, Saguna. So what is the Love Canal Redaction Project? Between 2024 and 2025, the University Archives at the University of Buffalo undertook what we called the Love Canal Redaction Project. This was a comprehensive initiative to ethically open a series of restricted oral histories documenting one of the most defining environmental crises of American history. These interviews, recorded between 1978 and 1979, total over 90 individual interviews, capturing voices of residents living through the unfolding disaster at Niagara Falls, New York. These are rich in personal history, including accounts of illness, fear, and activism, but also filled with identifying information that required careful handling. Our project set out to make this material accessible responsibly, balancing research, ethics, access, stewardship, and the dignity of the people whose stories were preserved. On the right, you can see an example redaction slide that highlights removing a resident's name and occupation, and we'll discuss some of these redaction categories that we used in upcoming slides as well. So let's get into the historical context and why these interviews matter. The Redaction project was necessary as an effort to revisit what happened in Love Canal. So the story of Love Canal begins in the 1890s when entrepreneur William Love envisioned a modeled industrial city powered by hydroelectricity from the Niagara River. The project failed, leaving behind a partially dug canal bed. Decades later, in the 1940s and 1950s, Hooker Chemical used that abandoned canal as a dumping ground for over 20,000 tons of chemical waste, including dioxins, benzene, and chlorinated hydrocarbons. They covered the canal and metal drums with earth and clay and sold the land to the Niagara Falls Board of Education for $1 with a written disclaimer noting the buried waste. In the following decades, the 99th Street School and a suburban neighborhood of roughly 800 homes was built on and around the site. For years, the contamination was not widely acknowledged or known about by the residents. But by the 1970s, residents began noticing disturbing signs, such as chemical odors in basements, corroded sump pumps, and children developing rashes after playing outside. The turning point came after the blizzard of 1977, when massive snowmelt raised the water table and chemicals noticeably seeped into yards and homes. Residents reported miscarriages, birth defects, epilepsy, liver disorders, and a range of other unexplained illnesses. Desperate for answers, the residents began organizing. Lois Gibbs, a local mother of two, formed the Love Canal Homeowners Association. That organization's activism became national news. Television crews arrived and residents protested in Niagara Falls, Albany, and Washington, D.C. They blocked roads and held sit-ins demanding relocation. In 1978, the New York State Health Commissioner declared a state of emergency, closing the elementary school and ordering pregnant women and young children to evacuate. Based on the substantial and intense local activism, within 2 years, the federal government had purchased hundreds of homes for demolition and relocated additional families. The public outrage surrounding Love Canal directly led to the passage of the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act, CERCLA, better known as the Superfund Law, which established federal authority to clean up toxic waste sites and hold polluters accountable. Love Canal as a whole became a symbol of environmental injustice, corporate negligence, and citizen activism. And this is the world where these oral histories were captured, residents speaking at their kitchen tables as this crisis unfolded. So let's talk about the oral histories that are at UB. At the height of this crisis, Dr. Adeline Levine, or Addie, a sociologist at UB, launched a study to document the social and psychological impacts of Love Canal. Working with graduate students, she conducted in-depth interviews with residents between 1978 and 1979. One of the graduate students, Penelope Plowman, gathered additional interviews, photographs, and media documentation for her ongoing dissertation, which was published in 1984, which analyzed how the press shaped public understanding of the disaster. These interviews, conducted in real time during the crisis, became an extraordinary primary source of residents describing illness, frustration with officials, and the daily realities of life living inside of a toxic neighborhood. The university archives initially received Penny Plowman's papers in 2008, establishing the first collection containing Love Canal oral histories and additional archival materials. A collection of papers from Adeline Levine was donated in 2016 by her husband after she passed. And then in 2025, the Buffalo History Museum transferred an additional Adeline Levine collection, originally donated in the early 1990s, containing an additional 42 interviews. And this united two halves of the original research project. This resulted in a consolidated archive of over 90 interviews documenting Love Canal residents' experiences. And these collections were the foundation for the Redaction project. And for the first time, a complete sociological record of the project and the community's voices was under one institutional roof. And on the right, if you want to go back for just a second, Saguna, I was just going to say these images are all part of Penny Plowman's collection at the University Archives that's accessible through a digital collection. This is some of the protest signage that the residents put in front of their houses in reaction to the ongoing community activism. So let's talk for a bit about the choice to redact the interviews for access. For decades, these interviews were closed to researchers at the University of Buffalo, and they had limited access with a signed confidentiality agreement through the Buffalo History Museum. The main reasons were legal risk. So at the time of donation, there was ongoing litigation with Hooker Chemical and his parent company, Occidental Petroleum. This was a large concern and a motivating reason for the early restrictions, especially in regards to the History Museum collection from the early 1990s. Privacy concerns. So the material contained detailed references to medical conditions and identifiable information about residents, and the practical. So this related to inconsistent or incomplete consent documentation around the interviews. It's really important to note that these restrictions, both at UB and at the History Museum, were not specified or imposed by the interviewees themselves or by the original collection donors. The majority of the resident interviews did contain signed consent forms similar to the image on the right on the screen, allowing for the interviews to be accessed for research purposes. However, the language and the agreements were used somewhat inconsistently between interviews based on who was doing the interviewing. The archival collection restrictions were added by archivists and collection staff who were navigating sensitive information with caution and limited resources. By the early 2020s, the majority of the interviewees have passed away. Consent forms have been re-reviewed, and scholarly interest has really grown related to environmental justice and local history. At this point, the University Archives made the decision to revisit those restrictions, aiming to open the collection responsibly rather than keeping it closed into the future. So this question, or this decision, raised a difficult question at the heart of archival ethics. How do we provide access to historically significant testimony without betraying the trust of narrators who spoke during a moment of crisis? We were really weighing access against privacy. And our solution was to design a multi-layered redaction process that emphasized transparency, documentation, and care rather than invisible removals or an ongoing restriction scheme. The image on the right of this slide is actually the original tape recorder and microphone that was used to capture the interviews in the late 1970s by Penelope Plowman. So after extensive discussion, we built a 3-tier model that involved multiple reviewers with different areas of expertise. The first review was conducted by a graduate student from UB's Department of Environment Sustainability. She conducted a line-by-line review on printed transcripts, redacting names, addresses, and sensitive identifiers by hand. The second review was done by our digital archivist, Grace Trimper, who assessed those decisions for consistency and advised on more technical procedures like secure digital redaction. And then a final review done by me, reviewing ambiguous cases, more complicated issues, and ensuring that the redactions protected the dignity of our interviewees without erasing key historical evidence. We met regularly throughout this process to talk about our guidelines, general rules for information redaction, and to talk through more ambiguous or complicated redaction decisions. This process ensured accountability through multiple perspectives, environmental, archival, and ethical. For example, and we'll talk about this a little bit later as well, some of the standards for redaction we used were removing names and addresses of interviewees, names of children, ages, former places of residence, and occupation. This followed standard categories of PII, or personally identifiable information, in archival collections, and in most cases, it redacted over the normal standards in the interest of privacy. We specifically wanted to redact as little as possible to preserve the overall narrative, and had ongoing discussions on deciding what was enough. So I wanted to show an example of an interview account and why this narrative and the interviews are important to the historical narrative overall. On the screen, you can see an account of an early resident. They recounted memories of when Hooker was actively dumping on the canal site. You can see how it's a firsthand account of a personal interaction, seeing Hooker Chemical employees putting the drums in the ground or burying them, and then also talking about ownership of the land and who they saw putting materials into the ground there. In this instance, the W and the H are what husband and wife, the I is interviewer. And this is an example of that first person narrative that might not be inherently identifying, but is really important to the narrative of Love Canal overall. The next slide is another example of a personal account related to toxic exposure. The development of CERCLA and the story of Love Canal can be told from a lot of different perspectives. The EPA, the government, sometimes it centers around the creation of that original legislation. This collection highlights how individual people and experience the disaster. This is also an example of how little we needed to redact overall. There are large portions, and in the majority of the interviews that don't have that are openly accessible to researchers. We really tried to take out as little as we could while also making sure that we were taking out categories of information that should protect the privacy of the interviewees. We adopted 5 guiding principles to make this process transparent. We used visible redactions, black bars instead of deletion, to ensure that the removable was visible to researchers that came in or individuals. We preserved the hand-marked copies. Those are kept in a restricted file for audit and accountability, but you can see the decision-making process of why we decided to take things out or leave things in. Written redaction policies are deposited with the collection materials to help explain that overall process. And secure digital methods, so metadata removal and permanent deletion for the digital copies that were created. And then finally, right at the moment, we're providing print-only access to protect against uncontrolled digital dissemination and informed context when accessed by researchers. We want to make sure that when researchers access the collection, they have an archivist that can answer questions about process, procedure, and general information about the collection. This approach balanced the need for transparency with the responsibility to maintain trust. Throughout this process, we met regularly as a team to discuss difficult decisions. Again, we'll be talking about more examples in just a bit, but for example, when a mother was describing her child's experience with Love Canal, either in relation to blood testing or understanding the protests, we debated on how to retain the evidence of harm or impact without revealing personal details that could identify the family. In those moments, redaction became much more of an interpretive act and a dialogue about ethics and not simply a technical task. We saw redaction not as censorship, but as stewardship, and as a way of preserving testimony while minimizing potential harm. At this point, I'll turn things over to Saguna, who will describe how we implemented access and how the collection is now used, providing some examples, and to talk about what this project has meant for UB and the broader archival community.
Thanks, Hope. So to continue on, and to help illustrate this complex and this contextual decision-making in the ongoing redaction work, I want to take you back to our most recent meeting that Hope, Grace Trimper, and I had. And we were discussing several issues of whether to retain or redact certain information about residents' lives. So one topic of conversation that I'll share over the next few minutes is how to handle details of renters who lived in public housing in the Love Canal community. We wondered, what should we keep in? How might we and others learn from renters' experiences, which are increasingly of interest in studying environmental justice, as Hope mentioned earlier? And what information should we retain to allow those kinds of learning opportunities while redacting enough to maintain dignity and privacy? So to provide some background, leaders of the renters were important in early environmental justice efforts, yet renters have so far been underrepresented in many histories of Love Canal. Researchers and journalists covering the crisis at the time tended to pay less attention to renters who were predominantly self-identifying as low-income and racialized community members, and who lived just as close to the toxic waste as the homeowners. Griffin Manor is the name of the public housing development pictured on this slide, where about 1,200 people lived in rental units. And in the late 1970s, renters formed their own association and coordinated on some activities with the local chapter of the NAACP, as well as the homeowners and their association and a faith-based environmental group. The Renters Association had multiple leaders, and from primary and secondary sources, there is evidence that at least 5 women were publicly involved in advocating for renters' rights. As Lois Gibbs, who is a prominent activist and pictured earlier with her children, has noted on the crisis, as the same time as we see multiple page spreads about the homeowners, TV coverage of the homeowners led by Gibbs, other fellow leaders with whom she collaborated, particularly those representing the renters, were largely ignored by the media. Since there are few other records on leaders of the renters, references to their work in the interviews with residents is incredibly valuable to research, storytelling, and public memory of the crisis. So with that said, that background shared, I'll move on to what this issue looks like in practice in the next 3 slides. One interview transcript, for instance, included a reference to a woman named Aline Thornton. And we redact individuals' names when they're mentioned in a non-public capacity as a friend, a family member, or a neighbor of an interviewee, for example. In this case, though, we opted to retain Thornton's name because she was acting as a public figure in the Renters Association in the context of the interview and other archival records like the one that you see featured on this slide. This decision allows details on public figures like Gibbs and Thornton alike to be represented equitably. To move on to another example, we also thought about how to represent renters and where they lived in the public housing complex. So renters lived in Griffin Manor, or the LaSalle development as it was called. And when interviewees talked about this public housing complex or their experience of being a renter, we retained that information. And we did this by keeping in references to the name of the public housing complex. And you can also see that represented here in some rare news media coverage of renters advocacy. On the other hand, though, when we encountered interviewees talking about family and friends who lived in a certain apartment block or a court, as it was called, we redacted the specific building location information. So keeping the location information in would have put them or others at risk of being personally identifiable. And specific location in the complex would not add further meaning about interviewees' experiences as renters, so we redacted that. To move on to a third and final example, this one is a bit more personal. And since the original sociological study took an interest in how people self-identified, there is a question that researchers asked each person about community members' ethnic and religious background. So this information, as you can imagine, is rich, but it's also too risky to retain because it would make people personally identifiable in this small scale regional study. If all interviewees were homogenous, this information wouldn't be all that sensitive. But specific distinctions in these interviews that we have noticed would make people traceable, especially given the minoritized specific backgrounds that some interviewees were discussing. Other records of population level demographics at Love Canal are already available as well. So we are redacting this more sensitive information from each of these interviews. So I hope that those 3 examples gave a sense of our deliberations during redaction. And we wanted to both care for the records and for the community members who were involved in their creation or who might be affected today. These procedures dovetail with the tradition of care ethics, which comes from feminist theory, which has also been built on in archival and information science. And ethics of care does call for reflexivity in how our situated knowledge influences our ideas of what is right or morally good, which is shaped by our positionality, our place, and our power. So each of us, as members of the team, brings different situated knowledge of the crisis and these collections, as well as the place and the time in which interviews were conducted. This allows us to think through the details of people's lives more holistically. And for us, this means we appreciate the multiple roles that residents and interviewees often held. And there are many. People were speaking as neighbors, they were speaking as mothers, fathers, guardians of children, renters, or homeowners, and also as activists, employees, citizen scientists, leaders, voters, as well as private or public individuals. I would also suggest that close reading of the transcripts requires this humanistic decision making that could not easily be applied as a set of rules or automated. In this project, it takes group reflection, imagination about future uses of these records, and discussion to help implement the redaction policies that Hope has developed. So I've heard members of the redaction team talk about redaction as more of an art than a science, and I think that's been my experience so far too. So let's zoom back out on our procedures. And I want to take a beat here to acknowledge Grace Trimper and Hope for their expertise and their long-standing work on this project, which makes up this next section. The team went through review and deliberation discussed earlier with a print copy of each interview transcript. And after that, the first reviewer permanently removed sensitive information from the digital file using Adobe Acrobat. This blocked out and deleted associated metadata and the text in the digital file to render the redacted interview transcripts. For ease of access and for provenance, the team then printed 2 copies of each redacted interview, which are now available in UB's Special Collections reading room. The team deleted the original unredacted scans and retained 1 digital copy of each redacted interview for internal purposes and as a backup to the physical collection. We are repeating this process now for the remaining interviews. And these remaining interviews came from a recent addition to the Adeline Levine papers, and Levine was the original researcher leading the interview project. Throughout this process, the redaction team has been creating an audit trail of these decisions we've been making. Our annotated working copies are included, but they are restricted since they contain original unredacted information. We saw that retaining these printed drafts along with the final redacted interviews would be helpful for accountability. Reading room access to the collections alongside our notes and the redaction policy will allow us to answer researchers' questions about the project itself and to help archivists who work with this collection in the future, as well as encouraging open engagement and discussion about this project. Prior to when I joined the redaction project, the redaction team had spent a long time exploring how to provide access to the collection and questioning the ethics of publishing the digitized interviews in an online digital collection. At the time of the interviews, researchers and interviewees couldn't have imagined that digital access would be available. So although digital access may offer visibility and increase access to archival materials, it does introduce risk and doesn't allow for the potential that some people might want to exercise their right to be forgotten or not to be tied to what was said almost 50 years ago now. The specific nature of the crisis and the sensitive issues at hand led the team to choose physical on-site access rather than digital access. On-site access controls mean that the interviews cannot be copied, decontextualized, or manipulated. And each researcher encounters this transcript within their proper context. So that means that archivists like Grace and Hope can be there to answer researchers' questions about how and why we redacted the interviews. This contextual access approach aligns with recent scholarship, emphasizing that responsible stewardship includes protecting narrative integrity, as well as providing access to records. In the future, these records may be more widely available, but for now, reading room access supports these goals. UB's university archives are both an institutional and a community archives. While housed within the university, It serves the broader Buffalo Niagara region in which we're situated, and in Hope's leadership in consolidating the Plowman and the Levine interviews and opening them responsibly, the archive serves as a steward of local memory. The redaction team designed policies, first of all, to honor residents' humanity and their right to privacy, rather than striving to protect institutional liability, first of all, as a primary goal. This project treated interviewees not as data sources, but as community members whose perspectives are essential to regional and to national history. The collections are living and changing, particularly with this recent edition of the redacted interviews now open to the public. UB's archivists have published the finding aid for this collection a few weeks ago, and they've been weaving in the redacted interviews into students' coursework and researcher studies in environmental science and sustainability, sociology, as well as archival science. We also announced access to the redacted interviews in our recent exhibit entitled Toxic Archives, which Hope and I co-curated, and this exhibit opened last month in UB's Silverman Library. The exhibit elevates Love Canal residents' different voices and experiences of the crisis while reporting on this interview redaction project to highlight ethical stewardship. Following the exhibit opening, I heard that visitors and former Love Canal residents have talked with Hope about how they're noticing their stories handled with care. And some residents have even offered additional records to the collection after visiting the exhibit. We interpret these as important signs of trust from community members. So the redaction team identifies several takeaways that may be transferable to other projects. The multi-layered review of transcripts strengthens rigor and accountability. Retaining our notes, drafts, and our policies supports transparency and trust building. Print-only access supports responsible stewardship. Interdisciplinary collaboration of members of the redaction team broadens our perspectives and helps to reduce our bias. We also see preservation can enhance and advance environmental justice histories, and public memory of crises like these. And this is a role in which GLAM institutions can be leaders. We also recognize and want to appreciate the sometimes heavy emotions and severe experiences in the interviews. And we see this as ethically intensive labor with a need for breaks and debriefs as team members for self-care. And finally, this process includes continued reviewing of restrictions applied to these materials. So to sum up, we see that redaction can be guided by an ethics of care for collections and for the people affected by them. And we can do this while opening up collections for learning.
By doing so, we're trying to position the UB's university archives within a larger conversation about how to preserve sensitive community histories ethically. Our project is at its core about what archives mediate between memory and justice and evidence and dignity. We'd also like to emphasize that this is an ongoing project and process. As archivists, we're navigating a complex collection to the best of our ability and attempting to honor the interviewees' experiences as well as their original intent to share it with a wider research audience.
We look forward to having a conversation during the Q&A, and we would be interested to hear any connections you see to your own work as well. So thank you for joining us and for sharing any questions or connections that you see.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. We're particularly interested in other institutions addressing similar challenges and balancing access and stewardship. This really was a project that developed over time. There's a lot that we can talk about in the Q&A portion that we just didn't get to in the presentation. And hopefully we can answer some questions specific to how we made choices, why we made choices, and what this project looks like moving forward. And with that, I will look through the chat. I know someone asked early on about the photographs that we were using in the slides. Those are part of the University Archives collections on Love Canal. We're the largest repository of material related to the environmental crisis of Love Canal in the region, and I believe in the state. That sort of grouping of collections comes from a lot of different places. So we have the papers of the Ecumenical Task Force, the Love Canal Revitalization Agency, Penelope Plowman's papers, which includes manuscripts, photographs, a whole bunch of different types of material, as well as donations from community members individually. So the photographs you're seeing are part of a photograph collection that was donated by the photographer. So they were able to give us access to those. And those were all taken in mostly public settings during protests or community meetings. I hope that answers Ruth's question, but I'm happy to do follow-ups as well if it didn't in any way. Is there a future point at which the unredacted interviews might be unsealed, or are the confidentiality agreements signed at the time expected to be honored in perpetuity? Hi, Cynthia. So there is a world where these become opened at a future date. We want to be really careful with what that looks like. But when you say confidentiality agreements, we don't have confidentiality agreements related to the interviews. It's more an internal restriction period that we're going to have. Oh, I see. You're asking about the confidentiality agreements that were signed while they were at the History Museum. I think that the signees are probably bound by the terms that were imposed at the time of access. At this time, we wouldn't allow access to those interviews in the same way that they were accessed at that moment. I think that form factor, and I realize I'm talking to someone who has personal experience on this topic. That form factor depends a lot on the honor and integrity of the people that are signing them. I looked at some of the early interviews or the forms from the 1990s, and it really is almost an honor system. I doubt that the institution ever would have sued anyone who violated them. It really depended on good actors in a way that I wanted to make sure that moving forward, especially with the large amount of interviews, because it is almost double what it used to be, that we were putting on some guardrails and some safety features to make sure that those residents had additional protections. In addition, and I think this is going to come up in some of the other questions, a good portion of the interviewees, I want to say about 80%, have since passed. There aren't quite as many large privacy concerns for the individuals themselves that were interviewed that there used to be. So that's transitioned a little bit over time. Cynthia, I'm happy to answer additional questions as well. She's a colleague in Western New York. So let's see. I really appreciate all that's been shared. The maintenance of redacted copies for accountability is really thoughtful. When you say that they're restricted, is there anyone beyond staff in your office that can gain access to the originals? At this time, no, mostly because the process is still ongoing. We didn't want to put a deadline on this project or try and work to a deadline because this really does take very careful deliberation. I have a greater appreciation of why archivists put blanket restrictions on collections that are sensitive like this, because it takes a lot of work and a lot of internal discussion to mediate what is enough, what's sufficient, what's honoring the intent of the original interviews. As Saguna mentioned, in the 1970s, none of these interviewees really understood what the internet would be, which is the case for many of our collections. I mean, everything that was created prior to the internet didn't understand how information would be shared one day, in the same way that we probably don't understand how our information is going to be shared in the future. But at the moment, the redacted copies are the current access point. I do see a future where those do become open, but that's probably a bit down the line. Let's see, my family has an old cemetery near these former industries in Niagara Falls. They were not kept up for the longest time. I'm looking to do more research and possibly present a program. Librarian at the Central Library in Buffalo. Hey there, colleague. Thank you so much. And please do come in to do research anytime. There's a large portion of materials that I think would be helpful for your personal research. You can reach us at the university archives. I want to emphasize that we are a community archive, meaning you don't have to be associated with the University of Buffalo or be a faculty member or a student to come and do research. We are open to the community. I know that we're up in Amherst, so it's a little bit further out, but please come do research. And I will also say that the exhibition that Saguna and I co-curated is going to be up until September of next year. So there's plenty of time for people to come and visit and experience that exhibition firsthand. I think I can safely say that we're both very proud of that. And I'm just skimming through the chat right now for additional questions. I'm wondering if you spoke to any of the people interviewed or their descendants about preferences re-redaction, or as you move to make the collection accessible. One of the distinct purposes of oral history is usually to provide documentation of an individual's life or community with specificity, as opposed to anonymizing responses. But of course, descendants may not agree with their ancestors' choices in this regard. I'm wondering how you navigated this point. Sue, and I hope you don't mind that I'm sort of just answering on a roll. So I think this is definitely something we thought about with a lot of depth and a lot of detail. This collection and this historical event, while it is a historical event, was not that long ago. It's not like the Pan Am exhibition in Buffalo that happened hundreds of years where everyone is deceased. This is an ongoing part of a lot of people's lives. And we were very sensitive to the fact that even at our opening exhibition, we had residents that lived through this crisis come to that exhibition. So the way that Saguna and I treated the exhibition, the way that we're treating this redaction project is hopefully with a lot of care and a lot of good intention. That said, if there was, and I'll say this openly because this is a large audience, if there is anyone that was a current or was a previous resident or a family of a previous resident, please reach out. I really want to make sure that we're doing this carefully. I will also say that there were interviewees interviews taken as part of this project where the residents opted not to have their interviews included in a public collection, and we have honored that. So the interviews that are redacted and publicly accessible are where there was an explicit consent form and there was some form of permission given. If there was any form that showed that that wasn't given, it's not included in a public facing collection. I'll also say that this is really a step above what would be required otherwise, meaning we're really trusting the intent of the donors that didn't put any restrictions on anything, and we're really trusting the interviewees who conducted these interviews. So we have spoken to a couple of the donors that were part of that interview process to get an idea of how we navigate this in a really ethical way. And again, I will say this took a lot of time. I understand why archivists put blanket restrictions on collections this complicated, but we really felt this was an important narrative to have out there, and it showed a really specific and really essential portion of regional and national history. Are recordings part of the collection as well? And if so, how are those materials handled? So Sarah, we do have the original recordings. Those are restricted just because we can't mediate access within those without having issues of confidentiality. Eventually, when those original interviews are open without restriction, and this is going to be sometime, those recordings will likely also be open, but that I really want to make sure that that's done in a really careful and really thoughtful way. As soon as you make something available, it's available. And you sort of lose control and ability to mediate how researchers interact with that. So again, I just want to make sure we're doing that really thoughtfully. See, I'm wondering at what point in the redaction process might you come across information that makes most, if not the whole document redacted? Would you then just fully restrict it, or would you try and provide some sort of accessibility? So we were actually really lucky. The graduate students who conducted the project had a list of questions. So there's a lot of continuity between the interviews. It's actually interesting. The tone between the interviews changed based on who the interviewer was, which is a whole separate paper topic probably. But there isn't an interview that was so overwhelmingly identifiable where the entire interview was restricted just because they didn't they asked some introductory questions just sort of to get the resident comfortable with the process, but a good portion of it was about public facing activities or who they were working with on the Love Canal Homeowners Association, or really about community activism. So it really was outward facing as opposed to inward facing in a way that didn't require us to redact entire interviews, again, unless they opted to have that not be made publicly available. Let's see. Thank you to our colleague at SUNY Maritime for commiserating with us on how long those redactions take and how to do them really, really carefully. Um, let's see. Oh, I'm looking at Heather's question related to superseding archives redactions, and if that was ever received. So that's a really tricky question, and I think everyone's pretty aware of that Belfast project because that's the one that scares us all a little bit regarding archives and just donor restrictions generally. Um, I think that that is a situation. I don't want to say the situation's an outlier, but I don't want it to have a freezing effect on the work that we do that may or may not be impacted by it. Um, Again, there weren't any restrictions imposed by the donor or by their interviewees in regards to the interviews. Hypothetically, we could make these available, but I don't feel like that's archivally and ethically the right choice to make in this scenario. So I think that that's something we'd have to navigate. And I do think that at the university, we're well placed to make those arguments and have the support institutionally to be able to do that. The University Archives as a whole has received nothing but support from our overall administration, which is really, really wonderful. I have to say it's been a wonderful place to be a faculty member. So I think that that's something that we would have to navigate. If there was, I think that this would be a very different project if there was evidence of crimes, like in the Belfast project. I think that this would be a very different interview if it had those legality implications in a way that this is much more personal reflection and private sensitivity as opposed to a legal action. So I think that that's the differentiating factor there. And yes, Ruth, very, very excited that those consent agreements were included with the interviews. For anyone who's doing interviews into the future, please, please, please have good consent agreements. And just as a general PSA, make sure that they're consenting before and after the interviews are conducted. So while they might sign something at the beginning of the interview, please make sure that there's some paperwork at the end to ensure that they consent after all of the information's been granted in a public form. Let's see. Format for recording. So for the I believe you're talking about the tape recordings, Alexis, the original interviews. We have had those converted off their original media just for preservation concerns. I worry that down the line, if we did want to provide access, we wouldn't be able to get them off of the original media, which is the old cassettes, basically. So we are holding those internally restricted, not for any researcher access, but there was an ongoing preservation concern that when we wanted to make those available, and if we make those available, we wouldn't be able to. And Lisa's is just a great comment on early career working with the EPA on records management for the Superfund. Yeah, I really want to emphasize to everyone how much thought went into this and how this is an ongoing project. So again, if there are any voices from the community that we haven't taken into account, we are happy to do that. We have we have a whole slew of programming coming up related to the exhibition. While the exhibition itself is historical, we're having a lot of contemporary speakers come and speak in the spring. Those are all going to be hybrid events. So if anybody would like to sign up to get mailing, basically newsletters from the University Archives, please send me an email. I'll add you to our mailing list. But we should be having a couple of good Love Canal speakers. We're finalizing things with Keith O'Brien, who wrote Paradise Falls. Mike, Saguna, what's Mike's last name?
Shade, I believe,
Shade,
Mike
Mike
Shade.
Shade, thank you, from Toxic Free Future, and a bunch of different faculty members from UB in architecture, accessibility, or not accessibility, architecture, engineering, environment design, sustainability, and they're all going to be talking about contemporary environmental issues regional to Western New York, and then also Love Canal specifically. So if you are interested in any of those hybrid events, I'll share those widely, but please do send me an email and I'll add you to our general mailing list. And if this is the last call for any additional questions you may have. And thank you everyone so much for attending. This was a heavy lift, but I think it was worth doing, and definitely worth making available.
Thank you, everyone, for being here. And I did see one question a ways back from Madison, and thank you for asking about the representation of young people, minors in the interviews. That was a major consideration in terms of redaction. So we have been redacting any references to children, minors who were named, who were family members. Often we're seeing families speak about experiences. And in this crisis, of course, as many of you know, one of the first signs that these families had were their children falling ill and very specific types of symptoms. So in addition to needing to protect children because they are minors, there were also very identifiable symptoms. So any of those references to children's names, we've been taking out. We've also been taking out the ages, which would identify when they were born and be traceable back to them. So we have been taking that into account. Thank you for asking about that. I hope that helps to answer the question.
All right. Thank you everyone for being here today. And thank you to Saguna and Hope for leading the charge. This is our last webinar of 2025. So we hope to see you all in a slew of new programs coming out in the new year. And until then, I hope everyone has an excellent rest of your year and a great rest of your day. Thank you so much for being here with us.